Hello and welcome, everybody. Welcome to Introduction to Effective Sandbox Design. Here, of course, is our forward-looking statement. My name is Christopher Marzilli, and I'm a Global Platform Success Specialist here at Salesforce.
And I'm Rachel Beard. I'm also a Success Specialist here at Salesforce.
So now that you know a little bit about us, we'd like to know a little bit about you guys. How many people here are administrators?
All right, and how many of you are developers? I see some putting up hands twice. That's great.
So good mix. How many people here know all the different types of sandboxes Salesforce offers? We offer 4 different types. How many people know all the different types? All right, so less than half the audience.
All right, now be honest. How many of you are doing all of your development in your full sandbox?
It's a safe place. You can be honest.
Okay, we saw a couple.
Okay. All right, well, that's great. So, leading on to that, should we just do all of our development, all of our work in our full sandbox? Should we do all of our QA, our UAT, our training, our production support in our full sandbox? Well, there's a lot of issues with that, right? If you're doing all of that work in there, it can be very hard to be able to run concurrent releases, right? You'll be stepping on each other. You'll be bouncing each other. You're going to be fully reliant on this one full sandbox. It's going to slow down your development process. It's going to make it so that development has to stop so QA can begin, and then QA has to stop so UAT and training can happen. It's not, it's no way to be able to run multiple releases, and also it's going to be really difficult to run a refresh on that sandbox, right? Because you're not going to be able to stop all the different types of work. So Rachel and I are here to tell you there's a better way to do this in Salesforce.
So Salesforce Sandboxes are the key for your being able to build effectively in the cloud. You can have multiple copies of your production environment, either from a configuration standpoint only, metadata only, with your dev boxes, which we'll tell you about later, or a full copy sandbox, which is your data and your metadata. You can have multiple different versions. We have development tools that allow you to build and customize, and then you can use change sets and templates to be able to have easier deployments. And then finally, the metadata APIs and the IDEs for automation with your deployments.
Now, when we think about the software development cycle for Salesforce, you typically start with some ideas that the business comes up with, and then they put that on a backlog, and they get prioritized. And then they move into your development process, where your developers do your coding, your admins do your configuration, you start running your unit tests, and then you do your QA. Finally, you get into a user acceptance area, and then once everything's been tested and approved, you move that to production. When we talk about sandbox design and environmental management, this development process is really what we're focusing in on. And a lot of customers ask me, well, why does good sandbox design matter? Well, it's a best practice for creating to create separate environments for your development, for your testing and your training. And it also can help you develop a regular release cadence. It'll provide more stability for your active organizations. It'll allow your team to do UAT while development is still going on. You could run your QA cycles and still train your users in stable environments. Ultimately, even though you're going to be managing more environments, it's going to shorten your cycle times for your releases. And it'll also be able to create independent environments for realistic training and testing. This is going to lead to reduced operational risk. It'll allow you to continue to move and develop on the platform without having to stop your development when something goes wrong or when QAT needs to get an environment. It'll raise your productivity as your developers while they can be constantly developing on the platform while all the other parts of the software development lifecycle are happening. It'll increase your efficiency of your entire organization. Ultimately, it will lead to higher user satisfaction because they're able to train and test in realistic environments, and also it should lower the number of bugs you have in your UAT and production to increase that user satisfaction. And ultimately, it'll lead to increased business value. So now you know a little bit about why sandbox design matters. Rachel's going to talk to us a little bit about what the different types of sandboxes Salesforce offers.
All right, well, I did see a few hands go up that you don't know all the different types of sandboxes, so I'm going to give you a short overview. First end is going to be the Developer and Dev Pro boxes, which you can use for developing in isolation. These are your most agile environment to work in because you can refresh these every single day, and you probably have a ton of them. These are configuration only, so all of the customizations that you've made declaratively, as well as your coded customizations, but they do not include any sample data, so you'll need to be responsible for loading that test data on your own. A dev box has 200 megs of data storage, while a dev pro has a gig to test in. So you can develop in isolation in your dev box and maybe move to a dev pro for some combined QA until you get into your larger testing responsibilities. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have your full sandbox. This is your least agile environment, and this is why we don't recommend developing in your full sandbox. This sandbox can only be refreshed once a month, but it is a full copy of your production environment, both from a customization standpoint as well as a complete copy of all of your production data. This is the environment where you want to do all of your expanded testing in. Now, somewhere in the middle of these two sandbox types is a partial copy sandbox. This is a really great blend of the two because it comes with a full set of all of your coded customizations, your declarative config, but it also comes with a very easy way to get some sample data into that sandbox, which is a great time saver. You can get 10,000 records from the objects that you've selected using the partial data sandbox templates, and you have 5 gigs of storage, so it's a great environment there.
So Rachel, that partial copy sandbox, is that something new?
It's not new, but it is new for a lot of our customers. Some of you, if you have Enterprise or Unlimited Edition, if you go look at your sandboxes from your setup menu, you should notice that as of this summer, you have a partial copy sandbox. And this is an excellent resource for you to use for expanded testing purposes. Like I mentioned, you get all of your metadata and a sample of your production data. That sample should be considered random in that you're going to get 10,000 more or less recent records in the order that they were created. But as of right now, you can't filter those down. So if you want account records, you're going to get 10,000 recent accounts, but not just customers, not just prospects. And that's a good testing sample. Again, with 10,000 records, you will not exceed the 5 gigabyte storage limit. And if you need to add additional sample data, you can do that. And your file storage is exactly the same as it is in your production environment.
Now, Rachel, with those 4 different types of sandboxes that we have, what are some of the use cases that you would use one sandbox versus another?
You're really quizzing me today, Chris. So we have a great slide here on use case alignment. I use this with my customers all the time because I think that this is a very handy reference point. Your developer and your dev pro boxes are ideally suited for building in isolation, as I mentioned before, and some limited QA type of purposes. As you get more complex with the type of testing that you need to perform, you're going to want to move into your partial copies and your full. Partial is ideally suited for some of your integration testing, your batch data testing, and in some cases it can be suited for a training environment. But when you get into performance testing and UAT and staging, then you really do need an environment that mirrors your production, including the data volumes and the performance of your org. So I would definitely recommend to go to a full for that.
Awesome. Now that we know a little bit about what types of sandboxes we use when, I'd like to share with you some of the best practices that I've learned using sandboxes and I've worked with many customers. So the first best practice that I can offer you is to plan. When you think about your release process, determine which environments you need at the start of the project. Where are you going to develop the new features? Where are you going to test those new features? Where are you going to complete your UAT? And finally, where are you going to do your training? Map that out and develop a nice refresh and release calendar. A lot of customers that I work with, they have a release calendar. They know that certain features are going to come in Q1 and other features are going to come in Q2. But don't forget to plan your refreshing of your sandboxes. As Rachel mentioned, with your devs and dev pros, you get a 1-day refresh cycle. With your partials, you get a 5-day. And with your full, you have a 29-day. With these different cycles, you're going to need to make sure that you develop a calendar of not only your releases, but also of your refreshes. Also, determine your test data management strategy. Rachel mentioned that in the Dev and Dev Pro, we don't get data automatically. So how are you going to combat that? Developers will need some small subset of data to work and write their code and maybe even do some functional testing. How are you going to migrate that data? We offer a wealth of tools, both internally here at Salesforce, something like the data loader, and also we have many partners out there that can help with moving data around from different environments. What I would recommend is that you document what that process is, and that way it's easy for all of your developers to reuse and repeat. And then build some time into your plan for deploying your configurations between the environments. Once you've planned out the different environments you're going to use, make sure you work time into your schedules, into your sprints or release schedules to move your configuration through the environments, and make sure you have gated approval processes as you move those releases. So when development is done, it can move to a QA environment. Once QA signs off for it, it can move into a UAT environment, and once the business signs off, it could move into, say, either a training or directly into production. Also, as you start refreshing your sandboxes, make sure you document your refresh procedures for use across your multiple people who might be refreshing a sandbox. This is true for both devs and admins, since they'll typically work in different sandboxes. Documenting these procedures can make things a lot easier. For example, you might need to repoint some of your endpoints for your integration. Or again, documenting how you're loading that data in. And lastly, appoint a release manager or an environment manager on your team. It doesn't have to be a dedicated role, especially if you're a small company, but you should have someone who's in charge. They're the air traffic controller, I like to say, of your environments and your releases. So that way they can plan and make decisions and determine what activity is going to happen in what environment. And that person should also, by the way, be responsible for that calendar of your releases and your refreshes. So now that we know some best practices, let's take a look at a sandbox architecture. This is one that's very common here at Salesforce, although there's no one-size-fits-all. You'll need to determine what's the best design for you. But this is a great example of a multi-project delivery environment. At Salesforce, we like to talk a lot about doing multiple concurrent releases on the platform. Typically, that takes the form of minor or major releases, or minor and major releases. In this case, you can see that we have some short projects happening and a couple developer sandboxes in our minor release, while some of our longer projects are happening in a dev and a couple dev pros. That's our major release. What we do recommend, if you're doing concurrent development and multiple sandboxes, you create a roll-up environment, or some people like to call this a code integration or a code merge environment, where you can merge all of the code that's happening continuously and also be running your unit tests. So that way, you'll find out early and often if somebody's broken something. It's better to find out in the roll-up environment that a unit test broke than when you try to deploy to production. When you deploy your changes to environments, we don't necessarily require that you run your unit tests, except when you go to production. So having a roll-up environment where you're constantly integrating or merging your code and running your unit tests will allow you to be able to find issues with your code long before it hits QA, UAT, or even production. Once code has been ready and it's ready for QA, it's been approved, you would then move it into a QA environment. Many of my customers are now using this new partial sandbox that they received in the last release to do their QA. And what's been great about that is that depending on what the QA team is doing, they can use different templates. You can have multiple templates available to your QA team. So for example, if they're doing Sales Cloud QA testing, they can create a template that has accounts, contacts, and opportunities and refresh the partial copy. If the next week they're doing testing on the Service Cloud, they can create a template with accounts, contacts, and cases. And then once QA gives their sign-off, it can move into UAT, which we always recommend doing it in a full sandbox. Also, this is a great sandbox for your staging. And once that's been approved, you can then move it into production. But don't forget, you might need a training cycle as well. This is not always the case, depending typically with a minor release, maybe the enhancements are very small, you don't need a full training cycle. But with major or long-running projects, you might think about developing a training sandbox. Again, another great use case for the partial copy to give your end users some sample data to work on as they do their training. Another great use case for the partial is your production support. Having that environment that's not affected by the new development that's happening or the QA that's happening on new releases, having that environment that's a very close copy to production to allow your admin teams to do any QA or troubleshoot any issues that they might be having in production. So we've talked a lot now about these different types of ways to construct your sandboxes. I want to also talk a little bit about how you can move your changes from one environment to another. For your deployment options, the first option you have are change sets. This is a very declarative way to move your changes between environments. They're simple and easy to use. It's all point and click. You add your changes, your configuration, your code to a change set, and you can deploy it to any org within your environment, any connected org, that is. What is really nice about this is once the change set does hit production, production will keep a record of that change set in it. A second option, a little bit more complex, our developers like to use is something called the Force.com migration tool. This is a free tool provided by Salesforce. It's a command line utility built on an open source project called Ant. It leverages our metadata API and allows you to move packages that are represented by XML from one org to another. It's very useful for large development projects and also in cases where you have to repeat the same deployment process over and over again from one environment to another. It's heavily used by our partners organization. Lastly, there's a lot of third-party tools available to you to help you with the deploy. We have a metadata API that's open and available for anybody to build on, and there's a lot of tools that can help with not just deploying, but things like automation and continuous integration. The Eclipse IDE is one of these tools that leverages the metadata API that allow you to deploy. But we also have a lot of third-party partners out here. Some of them are actually right over here. They're great. AutoRabbit, GearSet Deploy, Capado, even Flowsum's over there. They can help help speed your deployment and also give you some options for how to continuously integrate your code. There's many others out there, so I would encourage you to search the App Exchange for many of our partners that can help you with this. So now that you know a little bit about some of your deployment options, let's talk about some recent enhancements that have happened with our sandbox.
Yeah, so this is actually one of my favorite new features in Sandboxes is that you can run an Apex class immediately upon creation of a sandbox or refreshing of a sandbox. My customers are using this in a lot of different ways, but I work in the industries team, so I have a lot of healthcare and financial services customers that are highly regulated. I like to recommend this as a way to automatically set up some of the profile permissions for your developer users. Maybe they have different levels of permission in the various environments they work in. They have full privileges in a dev box, and maybe less so in the full and maybe no access. So you can run these types of classes to fire off updates, send a service call, finalize some configuration tasks, and manipulate your data. Lots of great options there, but this will run before any developer even logs into your sandbox. So very good from a security standpoint.
And by the way, if you do document your sandbox refresh procedures, you'll be able to look through that document and find out what you can automate based upon this new post-refresh sandbox scripting.
And then quick deploy. This is actually a release that came last year, but a lot of our customers are not aware. And this is an option that can really help you speed up your deployments. You can set to run all tests, or run no tests, run local tests. There's quite a few options here, but this gives you some additional flexibility so that you can complete your deployment without having to rerun all of your Apex tests.
Another great feature that's currently in pilot is Sandbox to Sandbox cloning. This is a feature that's been asked for on the App Exchange for many years. It'll allow you to clone an existing sandbox and make an exact copy of it. That includes both metadata and data. When you clone a sandbox, you're going to get the same type of sandbox back. So if you clone a Dev Pro, you'll get another Dev Pro. You'll need to make sure that you have an available sandbox before you do a clone. It'll create the same type of sandbox, again, with both the metadata and data. So if you've preloaded data into a Dev Pro and clone it, you'll get both the metadata and the data. Keep in mind, though, it's not a refresh from production. So any changes that have happened in production in the time that you have refreshed the source sandbox, it will not show up in the target. It's just an exact copy of that source sandbox. And also, make sure that you know that they do become standalone. So there's no syncing that happens between the two clones. So once the source has completed its clone, you'll end up with two sandboxes that are exactly alike. This is really helpful if you need to speed development or quickly spin up a bunch of sandboxes for a group of developers who are working on different features, maybe that they don't need to work together. Another great use case that my customers gave me was there always comes times when you're working in your sandbox, but you do need to refresh and you don't want to lose that work you're doing. Build that change set, and then clone your sandbox. You can then refresh your source sandbox, and once the refresh happens, move that change set from the target back to the source. So that way you don't lose anything. It's a couple extra steps, but it makes things really easy for you to be able to refresh that sandbox without losing your changes. So now that we know a little bit about the features, where can we go to get more information, Rachel?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a real nerd over Trailhead. I really enjoy reading those modules. I think that somebody who wrote them is very funny, but they're great to read through. They have some excellent learning exercises, and I particularly enjoy the build exercises. So you can get a free developer edition environment. You can complete the instructions to build, and then Trailhead will actually check your work to make sure that you understand the materials that you were supposed to learn. So we've given you links here, and these slides will be posted to the Success community. But we've given you some links here to the application lifecycle management trail, which I think is very useful, as well as the change management trail. And then finally, I would encourage you, if you have Premier Success, that you should ask your success manager about the accelerators that are available. Chris and I are both accelerator specialists, and we work with our customers on these targeted engagements to bring forth some very personalized recommendations about sandboxes, but about a number of other architecture and app cloud topics.
Great. So we wanted to leave some time at the end of the presentation to have some questions from our audience. I'd love to take any questions you have about sandboxes, or if you have any scenarios that you want to present to us and how we might architect them, we're happy to answer that. We don't have a microphone, so I'm going to walk down here to the audience. You let me know if you have any questions. Can I walk down here? Okay. Have questions. Right here. I'll come to you next.
So what will be the best approach?
Yeah, so the question is, what's the best approach if you have multiple developers, say, let's say 10 is a just reasonable, working on the same project at the same time? So, there's two options you really have, and you need to understand what's best for your team. In the case that they're all working on something and maybe they have dependent tasks related, it's good for them to work in a team sandbox. All right. You can, however, have them work in separate sandboxes in isolation and use a tool to integrate their code to that roll-up sandbox like I had up here earlier. That's not always the best solution, though, if they truly are dependent on one another's tasks. In the case where they're not dependent on each other's tasks, isolation does make sense. So you need to kind of work it. If they're meeting in a scrum every day, having the team sandbox usually makes the most sense.
But it's really critical that you get that testing done early on and that you can QA their work against each other, so that way you prevent having these larger collisions when you get later in the stage of your release process. And that's why it's really important. We see a lot of customers who are developing in full, or they're going right from a dev to a full. You want to make sure that all of that testing is complete before you get to that UAT stage.
Yeah. So the question is, with the partial data sandboxes, is that at times you could break your lookup relationships, and that's something that there's no magic bullet there to solve for that. The key is when you create your template. Typically, when you check off an object, it'll show you what objects are related. It'll kind of highlight for you. So make sure you select that. It does its best because it's a random sampling of data. So there's always the possibility that those things can be broken. If you require those relationships to be functional and working for your code to be testing, you probably want to look at other options other than partials, or use partials for areas where that's not required, and then leverage tools like the data loader or some of our other third-party tools out there to build the tree of data that if your code is dependent on those lookup relationships being there.
Yeah, I was just going to say tooling. There's great tooling for loading data. Some of these vendors, AutoRabbit, I got to watch a really cool demo there yesterday of their data loader tool. Definitely check that out.
Yeah. So the question is, so you're newer to Salesforce. You stored some settings data in a custom object, and when you refresh your Dev and Dev Pro, you don't get that data in. So actually, my suggestion to you is look into something called custom metadata types. Also, custom settings is another option too, but custom metadata types is a better option for you. It's very similar to custom objects, but it's only accessible to administrators in setup, and that's a good place to store your settings data. The big advantage there is that when you refresh any sandbox, any type, you always get the data that's in the custom metadata types. You can think about them as custom objects for settings data. Yeah, so it's not, you would have to migrate your data over, but honestly, the way you set up a custom object and a custom metadata type is very similar, and then you can just move the data over once, and then every time you refresh a sandbox, you'll always get that data.
And the only thing I'd add to that is that if this is a concern that's coming from a managed package, which I've seen a lot with our ISVs, to make sure you check with them about their refresh instructions, because they may have some setup checklists that will make that easier for you.
That's a great question. So the question is, they use a full sandbox for UAT, but they need to have the data obfuscated. You probably work in a regulated industry. And data obfuscation means that you need to change the data so that the people can't see any personally identifiable information, maybe social security numbers or credit cards.
Can I have that one?
Yeah,
that's my favorite.
I know.
So I do a lot around security and compliance. Like I mentioned, I'm on the industries team, so I have healthcare and financial services and government customers, and data obfuscation is probably the weirdest term that I have to pronounce, but it's really critical for compliance reasons. So that feature that we mentioned earlier, that you can run a script immediately upon refresh, that's a great tool for data obfuscation. So data obfuscation is maybe I have credit card numbers or birth dates or social security numbers. When I refresh my full, I'm going to get that data from production. So I want to make sure that that data is masked so that my developers don't have access to it when they don't need to. So partly it's running some kind of a script to cover up that data or eliminate that data. And then the other part of it is actually making sure that you have the right developer permissions for your sandboxes. And that's an area of risk that I see neglected often. So you want to make sure that your developers don't have too much access. Really, they shouldn't even necessarily need access to your full sandbox. So you want to make sure that your access controls are similarly tight in that environment.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I've worked in the financial industry where I was developing for a customer, a large bank, where they actually would not give me access to UAT in production, and that was just for those compliance reasons. But yeah, using the post-refresh sandbox scripting is now a great way. You could blank out all the social security numbers or change them to 999999. Those are great options. What other questions do we have? Else? Don't be shy. I don't bite. Rachel does. That's why I'm down here and she's up there. No? No other questions? All right, Rachel and I will hang out up here later. If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to come and visit us. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.